the history, the politics, the economics, the geography, all of that regarding the kahila, the congregation at Corinth. And so probably maybe as much for this book, and maybe even more so than any of the other books in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, the sociological, economic, religious factors that made up this city here is very important to understand the background of it, then to understand what it is that Paul Rav Shaul is trying to say. So this city is it's strategic geographically because it's on a 4.5 mile wide isthmus that bridged the Peloponnese and the mainland, and it separated the Saronic and the Corinthian Gulfs. You got the right here. You'll see. Here's Corinth right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor twirling around there. This is Corinth, but you can see this is a trade route that goes through here. Very important trade route that goes through this area here, and so this controlled a lot of overland commercial traffic between Italy and Asia, which for the most part, they found it safer and more convenient to take this inland route than to go around the Peloponnese, which are down here. Because if you go down here, a lot of times the little ships that, and we're only talking ships of maybe 40 to 50 feet long, and they would only have like a square sail, or they couldn't sail as close to the wind as you can with 4.5 sails, and 4.5 sails had really not come into their own at that point. So that's where Corinth is, and you can see here's a little bit better picture of where Corinth is. Here's Athens over here, and then this is the isthmus that we're talking about right here. Okay, and here I wanted to show you as early as 400 BC, they had traffic. They would land ships, and they'd at first they would offload cargo, put it on wagons, and drag it across the isthmus to the other side where ships would be waiting to take it on to Rome or wherever. But the Romans then saw the value of creating a marine railway. Now, those of you that have been with me a long time will recognize these pictures here that I've got of this marine railway that went between the two gulfs and across this isthmus. And in fact, here are the tracks, where these things here, the iron wheels, wore ruts into the road. For this was 2,000 years ago that they were doing this, and it wore ruts into the road. And you can still see part of this road is it's a Roman road. So Roman roads are built better than any kind of road that we've got today. And I'm not going to go back and redo what a Roman road is, because we did that in Acts. And so if you want to learn about Roman roads, go back to my teaching on the book of Acts, and I've dealt with it in great detail as to what the Roman roads looked like. And so that's one of the reasons that Corinth was so important, is because of the commerce that went across this 4.5 mile isthmus. Now, here I just took a picture of some of the ruins that they know of and that they've uncovered. of the ancient Corinth. And of course, on the outside of all of this, you would have the houses that people lived in. But this was the downtown area where the government had their functions, and the agora there was a kind of a marketplace. And then you had the couple of temples of Apollo, Octavia, and so forth. And here they had their amphitheater. And so that's just a kind of an artist representation based on the ruins that you can see of Corinth today. And of course, now here is the ruins that they have now. They've uncovered this, the Appian Way here. And Paul would have come up and down this road many times because he stayed in Corinth for 18 months. And then this area up here, they had a little fortress up here on top that they could kind of command, a real good view of the area around Corinth. And so that was a good defensive feature at that, right above the city. So a little bit of history. Basically, it's in two parts. It was a Greek city, and in fact, actually, Corinth was around for, it's been around for 4,000 years. People have been living in this vicinity for 4,000 years, and it really flourished. Well before, and then after the golden years of Athens, which was around, the 5th century BCE. And so, but because it was a leader in the area, it came in conflict then with Rome. And it was destroyed by the Roman consul Lucius Mummius in 146 BC. And the area, Corinth, then lay dormant actually for just over 100 years until it was refounded in 44 BCE by Julius Caesar, and as a Roman colony. The reason that he did this was probably twofold. I mean, it was a strategic location, as we talked about, for commerce, and the historian Strabo had talked about that. And basically, because it was so important to commerce, it made refounding of it, almost inevitable. And so all of the everything was there in place for this area to just be a booming economic city and so forth. So everything was there. It had a good water supply. By this time, then, of course, they had that big fort up on top, or the area that they could put a big fort up. It's called the Corinth, and they had plenty of water. By this time, they had a good relationship with Rome because they were no longer in conflict with Rome. And they basically controlled two major harbors on either side of this isthmus. And so that cross commerce there was very important. And then there were also what they called the Isthmian Games, and which were kind of like the Olympics, but they ranked just below the Olympics in importance. And Paul even talked about, or he made reference, to the games in chapter 9. And so then, second of all, the area was populated or repopulated by freedmen, they called them, from Rome, because Rome had a lot of those, and so they figured, well, we can farm them out throughout the empire, give them the equivalent of the 40 acres and a mule, give them land and so forth, so that they feel like that Okay, now they're free. They've got the means to support themselves. And so they're going to be less likely then to revolt or cause trouble for the Roman Empire if they feel like they're economically secure. And the other side of that coin is that these guys were they were not citizens; they were freedmen. They had a status that ranked just above a slave. So I mean, they were not that valued to the Roman Empire, but they could also cause trouble if enough of them got together and had a mind to. And so Rome was pretty much overpopulated with these kind of people. So they shipped them off to various places, and Corinth was a prime example of that. And then that way they could kind of rid themselves of the potential for trouble. And it also gave the freedmen an opportunity for economic gains, socio-economic advancement. And so a lot of these guys really jumped at that kind of a chance to do that. All right. And let's see. And I think we've talked about the geographic importance. I got the pictures that were there. Strabo, some 50 years later, after around 100 CE, he made abundantly clear that after it was refounded again, that prosperity came almost immediately. And since money attracts people, like dead meat attracts flies, I mean, that Corinth quickly grew. Great influx of people came from both the east and the west, and they had a lot of them had the skills. And so you had the good and the bad. You had the people that came in with the skills, but then you had the people that came in with the ills. They were the bad people. It's kind of like boom towns in the oil field in the United States, where you'd have good people coming in trying to make a real business, and then you had the grifters, the gamblers, the ne'er-do-wells who were just trying to take people's money. The gold rush had the same kind of thing. Corinth had that sort of thing too. Now, the Romans were dominant. Of course, this was a Roman colony. And so they brought with them Roman law and Roman civilization. But this is also in Greece. So their culture and everything, Rome could bring in their stuff. They could bring in their culture. They could bring in their religion. But Rome had already, I mean, really and truly, Rome had been thoroughly Hellenized. That means that they had a very large Greek influence. And so since Corinth was historically Greek, it maintained a lot of those ties: religion, philosophy, the arts. And then, of course, from the east, where going through this area, you'd had some of the mystery cults of, say, Egypt and Asia. And then the Jews also came in with their synagogue and their peculiar belief in a single God. How crazy was that? That they would only have one God, and you couldn't even see him. Not only that, you couldn't even make a picture of him or a statue of him. And silly Jews. And so, anyway, there were a number of Jews in Corinth. And so, since Corinth lacked a landed aristocracy, they didn't have people that had been there forever and had a lot of land and so forth, because the Romans had killed them all 100 years before. You quickly ended up with an aristocracy of money, and it was a very independent city, and not everybody could strike it rich, of course. And so you had a lot of the people down on the lower level, a lot of the blue collar workers, as it were, artisans and slaves actually made up the bulk of the population. And so, but most likely that wealth that was created by the first people, these freedmen that were in there, and they created that wealth, it spilled on because economics does have a trickle down effect, and that a rising economy floats all boats and so forth, and that I strongly believe that. So I'm not a socialistic economics guy, as you can probably imagine. Okay, so now, as often happens in such centers as this, you got vice and you got religion, and they seem to flourish right side by side. Now, old Corinth, before it was destroyed, it had gained a reputation for sexual vice, that it was so much so that the philosopher Aristophanes, if you've ever heard of Aristophanes, he lived between 450 and 385 BC. He coined a verb called Corinthiazo, and it meant to act like a Corinthian. In other words, to commit fornication. So if you were said that person is he's acting like a Corinthian, that means that he is an immoral fornicator kind of a person. So they actually had a Greek word for it. So that's the kind of reputation that that Corinth enjoyed, if I could say that. The Asclepius room in the museum there in Corinth today, it shows that there was that aspect of the city. There's a wall on that museum that have a lot of clay. I think they call them votives but just clay representations of human genitalia that had been offered up. These were offered to the gods of healing, to the god for healing. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, or the Roman or Greek, I can't remember, but that's the one that on today, where you've got the wings and the entwined snakes on a pole that everybody recognizes as being a medical symbol. Well, that comes from Asclepius. And so they would offer these things up to the god of healing, because for that part of the body that was ailing. And so, since a lot of these things were genitalia, we can kind of surmise that there was a lot of venereal disease, and of course, back in those days, there was no penicillin. So the folk remedies there would have to suffice. So I think a lot of times this aspect of the Corinthian life probably was overplayed by New Testament scholars. I mean, like one guy, Strabo, had said that there were 1,000 temple prostitutes, but that applied their trade there in the temple, in the temple of Aphrodite, and in up on that big old mountain up there, the Acrocorinth. But the thing about it is, he was probably Strabo was probably speaking of the old Corinth, the one before the Romans destroyed it. And even then, it's probably not accurate, because in Greek, the Greek mythology and the Greek aspect of religion, there was not that kind of temple prostitution. Okay, they didn't. That was not part of the worship of Aphrodite and the other deities of fertility and so forth. You saw that a lot in Canaan, because the Moabites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the all of those kind of guys. That was a big part of their religion, and that's why God said, "I want you to destroy them, get rid of them, get rid of their religion, so that they're not even on the face of the earth." But the Greeks were not like that. They didn't particularly have that kind of an aspect to their religion. So the idea that there was undoubtedly a lot of sin, immorality and fornication and that sort of thing, sexual activity going on in Corinth, because let's face it, folks, it was a port city. It was a city that, sailors came on both sides of that little isthmus, and they were just an hour's walk away from town. And, I'm sure that when they got off the boat, the captain would say, "Okay, these places are off limits to you, so don't go there." And so the sailors would check that one, says, "Okay, that's where we're headed." Having been a sailor for a good portion of my life, I understood that that's exactly what sailors do. You tell them you can't go someplace, that's exactly where they're going to go. And you can take that one to the bank. And in fact, whenever we would have a shore patrol, I stood shore patrol a few times. That's where we actually shore patrolled, was the areas that were off limits because they were dangerous, or they had known as for their promiscuity and disease and so forth. So, all right, enough of that. The religion of Corinth was just like its population. It was very diverse. There's a historian, Pausanias, that described at least 26 sacred places. Now, not all of these were temples, but sacred places devoted to the many gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon, because they combined them all, and sometimes they had different names for the different or different names for the same deity, same type of deity. But there were the gods and the lords. These were mystery cults that were actually mentioned by Paul in this 1 Corinthians in chapter 8 and verse 5. Now, Pausanias did not mention the Jewish synagogues, and actually they have found a partial lintel in the ruins of Corinth that has inscription in it that says "Synagogue of the Hebrews," and so we know that there was a synagogue there, because not only did Paul say that he did that, it was recorded in Acts and so forth, but they found it. So although there's probably no direct evidence for it, the very wealth that attracted artisans and tradesmen undoubtedly also lured to Corinth artists and philosophers of all kinds, all religions and all of it, in search of patronage, because if they a lot of these religions, cults, philosophers and so forth, they had to have a patron to give them money so that they could teach their type of philosophy and religion. So you would expect then that you would have had a lot of itinerants and charlatans, just the snake oil salesman, I guess, if you would. So all of this suggests that the Corinth of Paul was all at the same time. It was like New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas all wrapped up in one city had a population of around 100,000, and that was a large city for back in those days. In that Greek area of the world, only Athens surpassed um, um, Corinth in population. So uh, the the scattered pieces of evidence within Acts and First Corinthians and Romans suggest that the body of believers in that area was in many ways just a mirror of the diversity and the complexion, the demographics of the city. And at one point in chapter 12, verse 13, Paul interrupts his argument that he's making to emphasize the diversity of those who have all become one in one body: Jew, Greek, slave, and free. So this mix is substantiated in other ways as well, and of the people who are named in the body of this text of First Corinthians. You got three Jews, three Jewish names. You got Aquila, Priscilla, and Crispus. Those were Jewish people, even though they bore Latin names. And so there were 3 or 4 others that also had Latin names, were probably Romans, but Jewish. But that was Fortunatus, Quartus, Gaius, and Titius Justus. Now, at least 1 or 2 of these Gaius, Titius Justus were among the more wealthier people, and others had Greek names. There was Stephanus, Achaicus, and Erastus. Okay. And please don't laugh at my pronunciations. And of these, at least Stephanus and Erastus were probably wealthy, just based on what was said of them. And according to the congregation there, probably were not from the upper stratus. The most of the congregation, most everybody in the congregation, were not going to be in that upper socioeconomic strata. And in fact, in chapter 7 and verse 20 to 24, they even suggest that some of the people in the congregation were actually slaves. And the mention of Stephanus' household in chapter 1:16 probably reflects a situation where besides his family, there were slaves, or at least attached freedmen in his household. So if our interpretation, and we'll get into it later as we get into the letter, that there was an abuse of the Lord's table. That's in chapter 11. We'll see that. And some of the tensions that were in the community were between the wealthy and the poor. Okay, so that's one of the things that then Paul had to address. Now, there were, although there were a few Jewish believers in the community, very little in the letter actually points to a Jewish background. So there were at least 3 instances that speak of their former way of life, explicitly indicating that they were former idolaters, and they were, therefore they were Gentiles. So weren't a whole lot of Jews within the body of Messiah here in Corinth. And the whole thing about Paul talking about going to the temple feasts, and that's you'll see as we get into that, that's strictly a Gentile phenomenon. Their attitude toward marriage, thinking it to be a sin, does not fit Judaism, even Hellenistic Judaism, going to the proconsul or city magistrates for adjudication fits the normal processes of the Greeks and the Romans within the city, whereas the Jews then were forbidden to ask Gentiles for judgment. So the very idea that these people would just naturally assume that they could go to the Gentile judges, the magistrates and so forth in the city, pointed to the fact that they were probably not Jewish. And because the Jews were pretty much prohibited from going outside their community for adjudication. So, and they're in verse 6, they're the people there in the congregation arguing for their right to go to prostitutes, and then their denial that there was a future bodily resurrection also sounds a whole lot more Hellenistic than Jewish. So that's the picture that we have. It's one of, just basically a Gentile community. So, and again, they were pretty much on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, although there were in the congregation 2 or 3, 4, maybe wealthy families. Now, as former pagans, then they also brought to their belief in Yeshua, they brought in a Hellenistic worldview. I mean, how else? I mean, certainly they did, because that's all they knew. And with that, there was a certain attitude toward ethical behavior. And so, although they were the what would you call it? Well, I guess you could say the Christian church, or the Kahila of Messiah, the congregation of Messiah in Corinth. An inordinate amount of Corinth was still in them. They may have been in the body of Messiah, but boy, there sure still was a whole lot of stuff that Messiah had to get out of their body. And so that in some cases required a radical surgery that one of those little fragile things, radical surgery without killing the patient. And so this is what this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians it attempts to do. All right. So any comments or questions so far? All righty then, going ahead. Now, Acts 18 is where we find Paul going into Corinth. And it lays out the sequence of events of the beginnings of the congregation at Corinth. Paul arrived in Corinth it was on his second missionary journey, sometime early, like 50 CE, 51 CE, but not too far past that. And he came into Corinth, and he took up residence with Aquila and Priscilla, who had recently moved from Rome, and working with them in their common trade. They were tent makers. And so I was thinking about it today. Okay, now how in the world is he come into a town of 100,000 people, and he goes right to the 2 Jewish believers that had just moved from Rome to Corinth and connects with them? Now that is God's Holy Spirit working specifically to bring those 2 together. Because can you imagine? Well, for my our congregation at Tree of Life, can you imagine just driving into Katy, and there are half a dozen Messianics in Katy total, and you're going to drive in there and then find that half a dozen or just one or two of the only Messianics in all of Katy. It's just the odds are just way stacked against you, but that's exactly what happened. And so we see that, okay, now another thing, tent makers. He said that they were tent makers. And I've heard people come up with all sorts of ridiculous things about what Paul really was, that trying to, I don't know, make something that is not there, in my opinion. Because I've heard people say, well, what he really did, he didn't make tents, he made tallits, because when you put your tallit over your head, it's kind of like a tent. And so he was a tallit maker. Well, except for the fact that tallits had not been invented by this time. They did not come into practice. The Jews wore their tzitzit on their regular garments. They didn't have a separate garment for just a prayer shawl. Okay, that was a later invention. And so I don't know why people feel like that they have to go into the Bible and change things around to fit a certain philosophy when it's written right there in plain black and white. It says they were tent makers. Now, there was a and people have said, well, everybody lived in stone houses or wood houses by that time, and there were no tents. Well, that's wrong, because when people traveled, they would carry the provisions with them to make up a shelter, a lean-to, or if nothing else, or a pup tent or something like that, something to keep the elements off of them when they were traveling, because you don't always, there were no Howard Johnsons back in those days at every corner. And certainly there was no Motel 6 that's going to leave the light on for you. So they would have to go to areas, and they would go, they would not always have a place to stop. They would go with companions, and they would all be armed, because it was dangerous to travel back in those days. It's dangerous to travel now, but that's the way they traveled. And so they would carry with them. Soldiers also carried these temporary, portable tents with them, something that was small enough to keep the elements off of them. Certainly it's not something that you're going to live in, but it's enough to spend the night in and keep the elements off of you. And so that's what he did. He was a tent maker. And so Paul was one of these kind of guys that was, he was independent. He wanted to be independent. He did not want to be dependent on anyone for their support. And because, he didn't want to be beholden to anyone. But at the same time, he said, a workman is worthy of his hire. A minister should be supported. And in fact, once he was able to get support, he did not turn it away. He accepted it gladly, so that then he could be free to work full time in the ministry of preaching the gospel and bringing souls to the kingdom, without having to put in 8 hours a day or however many making tents. All right. So another thing, so the Kehillah was in Corinth was founded about 50 CE. We know that because that the Jews were kicked out of Rome in 49 CE, and the Bible says that Priscilla and Aquila had, or Aquila and Priscilla and Aquila, whatever, they had recently arrived from Rome. And so if you took it that they had arrived from Rome because they were kicked out, then that would put that right around 49, 50, 51 CE. Okay, now, one of the things that we learned about Paul was that it was his custom that he would arrive in a city and then he would spend 3 consecutive Shabbats preaching the gospel of Yeshua, explaining, telling them that the Messiah had come, and that he would, trying to convince them of the validity of Yeshua as the Messiah. He would spend 3 separate or consecutive Shabbats doing this in every city he went to. When he went into Asia Minor, all of those places over there, he would spend 3 weeks. After the 3rd week, if he was not, when he was plowing that ground, if he wasn't getting any results from that, or if they were angry with him or whatever, he says, okay, I have done my duty. I have preached the gospel to the Jew first, and now I'm going to those who will accept it, to the Gentile. So he went, same here in Corinth. He went to the synagogue and spoke to the Jews first. And there would have also probably been some Greeks in the synagogue as proselytes at the door, who were people who had not fully accepted Judaism to the point of going through circumcision. And that's what, they would take on all of the things of Judaism except for the circumcision. And so he did all of that, and until he was able to devote himself exclusively to evangelistic work, when Silas and Timothy came in from Macedonia, and you see that in chapter 18 and 5. So the Jews in Corinth, they very vigorously opposed Paul, and he found actually a more receptive audience, I guess you'd say, in the home of Titius Justus, or Titius Justus, who actually lived next door to the synagogue. And then also Crispus, who was the synagogue ruler. He and his whole household, along with many other Corinthians, believed, and they became believers, and they were baptized. You see that in chapter 18. So the Lord appeared, God appeared or Yeshua appeared to Paul in a night vision and assured him of the protection and the success of his ministry there in the city. That's in 18, 9, and 10. So he remained in Corinth for actually 18 months. Well, that was the longest he had ever stayed someplace up until this time. Later on, he spent more time in Ephesus, but up until this time, that's the longest he had ever spent in one place. So, but and then the persecution, he kept getting persecution from the Jews, and so eventually he left, but it was like 18 months later. And when he had come to Corinth, he was coming from Athens. Now, if you will remember, once he had gone into Athens, and he tried to preach the gospel in Athens, but all of these people in Athens, boy, they had got, they had many, many, many gods and lords and other things that they worshiped. And so he really, and they were happy with that. They pretty much, that was the center of Hellenism, and they really didn't have any desire to listen to the gospel. So, Paul, just like Yeshua says, when you go and you present it, and if they don't like it, you shake the dust off of your feet, and you go on to the next place. And that's what Paul did. It was a big disappointment to him, because in his heart, it explains in Acts that in his heart he really wanted to make a difference and make a dent in that population, so that they would accept Yeshua. But They did not. They were totally against it, or just ambivalent, and eventually he had to leave there, and so he went from there into or out of Athens. He dropped by and saw the folks at Berea for a little while. The Bereans, and the people that they heard the gospel, and they says, okay, that's fine, but let's search the scriptures ourselves. And so when they did, they just said, yes, the scriptures do say this is what it should be, and this is right, so we'll accept Yeshua. But they did that after searching the scriptures, and that's why we talk about Bereans being studiers of the word, and that's why our class that that I teach here, we're called Bereans, Messianic Bereans. Okay, so I don't know if any of you knew that or not, what the history behind that was. All right, so just going on, Paul had, let me make sure I got all of my notes here. This is the third actual engagement that Paul had with Corinthians, this letter that we're talking about, because the first, of course, is when he founded the congregation there, and then the second one, there was a letter that he had sent to them previously before this one, the First Corinthians letter, but it's been lost to history. I mean, that it was not it's not something that we have found, and so we don't really know what was in that letter. So this letter here that is to the Corinthians, it really would be the Second Corinthians, because there was already a First Corinthians letter, and then the next one would have been the Third Corinthians letter. But as it turns out, the only two that we have surviving is First Corinthians and then Second Corinthians that we have today. So Paul's, let's see, and this letter, we've already hinted at the fact that it's going to address a lot of moral issues within the body of Messiah. And there is, like Peter had said one time about talking about letting Gentiles into the body of Messiah, there was no small disputation, as it were. And so these guys were really going against Paul. I mean, he had started this congregation, and then they kind of turned against him. And so he's coming back at them because they're questioning not only his authority, his covering over them, but the very gospel that he's trying to teach and preach to them. They're trying to cut that down a little bit. Okay, so any comments or questions so far on this? I got just a little bit more to go, and then we'll end it for tonight, and then actually get into scripture next week. But I wanted to give you a good solid background so that we know what kind of people we're dealing with in Corinth, and what are the people around them, and the politics of the day, and so forth. So this relationship. Okay, I asked the question: are there any comments or questions? And I went right on gabbing. So far, nothing. Okay, I hope you're not asleep. All right, so Paul's.
No, we're not asleep.
Okay, good. Paul's this contentious relationship that he had with the Corinthians, it produced actually the two longest letters, the most correspondence between an apostle and a local congregation that has been preserved in the New Testament. There may have been longer ones, but they didn't survive. So we know more about the inner workings of the new Nazarene or Christian, if you will, community than any other. We know more about Corinth than any of the others, and so we know about their inner workings, and we have a better feeling for Paul's theology in this letter. And so there's just a gold mine of things that are, real life situations that we still are trying to mine all of these things today and figure out everything that Paul had said. So, we got all sorts of things that we can get out of the book of Corinthians, the First and Second Corinthians, about all wisdom, church leadership, the perils of sexual immorality, idolatry, things on marriage and divorce and evangelism and worship, and the greatest enemy of all to us, which is death. And so, there again, it's good to have those kinds of things for us today, because in this weekend, just this weekend alone, within a 48-hour period, in our small little congregation, we had 3 deaths within a 48-hour period, 3 deaths of people who are associated with our congregation. Of course, we had Mickey McGee, and then we had Jonathan Cooney's father, who passed away the same day as Mickey. And then last night, Sue Mon, her, our Hebrew teacher, Sue, her mother passed away yesterday afternoon. So a lot of people view death as something, oh my goodness, it's the enemy and so forth. But all of these people were ready to meet their maker. And so when you have believers that we know are ready to go, it takes that sting away. And maybe it doesn't take away all of the hurt. Of course it doesn't. But these are some of the things that we learn about in the first Corinthians and Second Corinthians. So it just reminds us that we need to stay focused and attached to Yeshua the Messiah. And with that, I will close it off. We're